Right. Okay. Let's dive in. You sent over some really interesting material about something that's suddenly become a huge deal here in Canada. Transnational repression. It's been impacting certain communities for a while, but now, well, it seems like everyone's talking about it. So the plan for this deep dive is to really unpack these sources you shared. We want to get clear on what transnational repression is specifically here in Canada and, why now? Why the sudden prominence? And crucially, based only on the material you gave us, what's actually being done?
Yeah, it's a really complex issue and important. It touches on personal safety, fundamental rights, but also national security. And these sources, they offer some very specific windows into Canada's experience and how the government's trying to respond.
Yeah, what really jumped out at me reading this stuff was just how layered it is. It's not simple. So let's start with the basics. What is this thing, transnational repression?
Well, the sources you gave us, they define it pretty clearly based on that Freedom House definition they use. Basically, transnational repression, or TNR, is when foreign governments reach across borders to, control their own people living elsewhere. Think harassment, intimidation.
Coercion, silencing them.
Exactly. Yeah. Silencing dissent, coercion, sometimes even physical harm, all targeted at diaspora or exile groups living here. And the tactics mentioned in the sources, they're quite specific. Things like surveillance, direct intimidation, denying consular services back home, using family members as leverage. That's the coercion by proxy bit.
Threatening family back home.
Mm-hmm. And relentless harassment, particularly online. Physical violence by foreign agents here is rarer, the sources say, but it has happened.
And the scale. Wow. It's not just one country, is it? The material points fingers at governments like China, Egypt, India, Iran, Pakistan.
Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Rwanda, Syria.
Yeah. That's a lot of countries potentially impacting people right here. Now, the sources say this isn't brand new, right? It's been affecting communities since at least 2017, based on the material. So if it's going on, why the huge surge in attention now? What was the trigger?
That's a key question, and the sources really link it to a few high-profile things happening pretty close together. First, there was all that media focus, remember, around 2023. About those alleged Chinese overseas police stations operating here.
Right, that definitely got people talking.
Then you had reports surface about specific politicians being targeted. The sources mentioned the example of Kenny Chiu during the 2021 election. Allegations of misinformation campaigns because he was critical of Beijing. But the real catalyst, the thing the sources call a clear escalation, seems to be the public allegations about India's government potentially being involved in Hardeep Singh Nijjar's assassination.
The Sikh activist killed in BC in June 2023.
Exactly. That shifted the conversation, didn't it? From harassment to alleged state-sponsored violence on Canadian soil. That felt, different.
It sounds like those events really forced the issue into the open, pushed the government to act more visibly. And the sources say this led to developing policies, mostly under that foreign interference banner, but also acknowledging the need for community resilience.
Precisely. But there's a really crucial distinction the sources make here, and it's easy to overlook. Yes, TNR can overlap with election interference, trying to shut up a candidate or scare diaspora voters. But framing it only as an election issue, that misses the point, according to this material. The sources are quite emphatic. TNR is an everyday threat. It's about people's basic rights, free speech, safety being attacked constantly, not just during an election campaign.
That's a really important point. If you only focus on protecting, say, the election system, you risk leaving the actual people affected by this day-to-day feeling unprotected, vulnerable.
Exactly.
Okay, so the government did launch formal investigations, right? The sources mentioned those. How did they go?
Well, the material talks about some earlier attempts. David Johnston's report, the NSI COP committee. But they were heavily classified, often didn't really satisfy public curiosity, and sometimes, like when NSI COP suggested MPs might have helped foreign states, they actually seemed to make things worse, stir up more fear.
Right, which kind of paved the way for the big one, the Hogue inquiry. The public inquiry into foreign interference started January 2025. That was because people wanted more transparency.
It was, and while Justice Hogue's main job was looking at foreign interference in elections, she absolutely did hear a lot about TNR's impact. People from Chinese, Indian, Iranian, Russian communities testified, shared some really harrowing personal accounts, surveillance, threats against family, consulates refusing services, nonstop online abuse.
What did Hogue conclude about TNR?
She was pretty blunt, actually. The sources quote her calling TNR a scourge in Canada. And she specifically named China, India, and Iran as the top 3 sources based on the evidence she heard. Interestingly, while she found foreign interference didn't likely change the overall election results, she did say it might have affected outcomes in specific ridings.
Okay, so she flagged TNR as serious,
Yeah.
but her mandate was still interference. Did she make specific recommendations on TNR itself?
The sources pull out 4 recommendations that directly relate to TNR from her report. One was a single point of contact, like a hotline for reporting. Another was a formal duty to warn policy so people at risk get notified. Also, engaging consulates to clarify boundaries. And importantly, specific RCMP training on TNR. Her report also mentioned things already happening, like the CSIS tip line, digital literacy funding, cybersecurity work, G7 cooperation.
So those are the recommendations. What's the analysis in your sources? Do they think these steps are enough? What are the gaps?
Well, the sources definitely raise some critiques. Take the hotline idea. CSIS already has a tip line, but the material questions how useful it is for TNR victims. Is online harassment a CSIS level threat? What happens after you report? It's unclear. And people in affected communities might not even know about it or frankly trust it. The sources mention the FBI experience, suggesting public follow-up is key to building that trust.
Okay, what else?
The RCMP training is good, but the sources point out, what about local police? They're often the first call someone makes. No mention of training them specifically on this, and then there's something the sources argue is a major gap, something largely missed by the inquiry and government work so far.
Which is?
Direct financial support for the diaspora communities themselves.
Ah, okay.
The argument is these communities know best what they need, maybe mental health support, legal help, digital safety training. They can design it, but they need the resources to actually do it. And linked to that, addressing the psychological impact, especially the digital stuff, the constant harassment leading people to self-censor, feel isolated. Funding for community support groups is vital there too.
Makes sense. Now, the sources also discuss new legislation. Bill C-70 passed June 2024. What did that do?
Right. The Countering Foreign Interference Act, it brought in 3 key changes, according to the material. New criminal penalties for things like harassment done for a foreign state, Canada's first foreign influence registry, and measures for security agencies to share more threat info publicly.
Okay, registry, new penalties, info sharing. What's the assessment from the sources on how effective this might actually be?
The honest answer seems to be, the jury's still out. The impact isn't clear yet. For instance, on the criminal side, the sources note authorities already had tools under existing law. They point to charges laid related to China and Rwanda and the arrests in the Niger case happening before Bill C-70.
So the new penalties might not be a game changer.
Perhaps not entirely on their own. Then there's the registry. Its goal is transparency, knowing who's doing political work for foreign powers. The sources compare it to FARA in the U.S. But crucially, it's registration, not prohibition. You register, you can still act. They even give an example. Someone registered under FARA still gathered intel on Paul Rusesabagina for Rwanda. And, let's be real, serious criminal actors won't register anyway.
So, not a magic bullet.
Definitely not. The sources frame it as one tool, but needing a much bigger strategy around it. And the information sharing part potentially useful for tracking TNR, yes. But concerns were raised, things like privacy, verifying info, the rush to pass the law, and the risk of accidentally painting entire communities with the same brush, which could ironically make people less willing to report. So it has to be done very, very carefully.
Okay, so laws and inquiries have limitations, but the sources also talk about something else, direct engagement with communities. That sounds promising.
It does. The material describes meetings that Public Safety, RCMP, Justice, CSIS started holding in early 2025. Invitation-only sessions with different diaspora groups in major cities.
What's the benefit there?
It seems to be twofold. One, getting information to the communities about the new law, digital threats, how to report, direct from the source. But just as important, it's a chance for community members to talk directly to law enforcement, to officials, to educate them about what TNR actually looks like on the ground. Many local officers might not have had specific training, so this builds awareness and hopefully trust.
And the sources really seem to believe in this approach.
They really do. One source concludes pretty strongly that this kind of direct engagement is maybe the most important thing a government like Canada can do to fight TNR effectively.
Getting that two-way street going.
Exactly. Practical info, trusted messengers, building relationships seems key based on this material.
What about looking outwards? Canada's role internationally.
Yeah, the sources suggest Canada's been quite active on the world stage with this. Taking diplomatic actions like kicking out diplomats from China and India after specific incidents, making public statements. And the sources highlight the transparency around the Niger investigation aftermath as being significant.
How so?
By publicly pursuing accountability, it sends a message globally. These actions have consequences. Diplomatic fallout, sanctions, they damage reputations, they reinforce sovereignty. It shows perpetrators can't always act with impunity.
And working with other countries.
Yeah.
Multilaterally.
Yes, coordination with the G7 is mentioned. The Rapid Response Mechanism since 2018, a U.S. working group from 2023. And significantly, when Canada took over the G7 presidency in January 2025, the sources say they made TNR a specific priority. Hosted meetings, a special G7 dialogue in Ottawa. Keeping that momentum going through the G7, the U and the sources see that as crucial.
Okay, one last area the sources touch on, which feels really critical, the immigration and asylum system. How is TNR impacting that?
That's a tough one. The sources say it's hard to gauge changes fully, even with more awareness now. They mention ongoing good practices, like screening Interpol notices or extradition requests for political motives, and the program for resettling human rights defenders. But here's a major red flag they raise. It seems immigration officials don't have specific procedures to vet accusations like terrorism or criminality coming from authoritarian states against people seeking refuge here.
You mean someone could be labeled a threat based on false info from the regime they fled?
That's exactly the concern. The sources use the example of Noura al-Jazawi, the Syrian activist. She was flagged as a security risk under Section 34 inadmissibility, basically because the Syrian regime considered her activism a threat. It took her 3 years to get permanent residency despite public support. And the question raised is, how many others are facing this quietly? Dissidents, activists, flagged based on politically motivated dirt.
Wow.
Because false accusations are a known TNR tactic, designed to silence people, make them deportable. The sources argue Canada needs screening for TNR vulnerability in immigration cases to stop Section 34 being misused like this.
So this deep dive really shows TNR is now firmly on the map as a major issue in Canada. We've gone from defining it, the tactics,
right, through the events that brought it to light, the inquiries, the new law,
the crucial need for community engagement, international efforts, and these really worrying immigration system vulnerabilities.
Yeah, the picture from these sources is one of definite progress. More awareness, new tools, outreach starting, international leadership, but also significant gaps remain, especially around directly funding and supporting affected communities and making sure all the response mechanisms are finely tuned and aware.
And the sources provide a clear roadmap, don't they? A government-wide definition, funding diaspora groups, feedback mechanisms, training all law enforcement, fixing immigration screening, spyware accountability, following through on G7 promises. Lots to do. We covered a ton there. Tracing TNR from definition to policy response. It leaves you thinking, though, if TNR is this constant, everyday threat affecting people's basic rights outside of elections, how does Canada, or any country really, implement the security measures needed against foreign interference without making things harder or creating mistrust within the very communities they're trying to shield?
That's the balancing act, isn't it?
It's definitely something to chew on. Thanks again for bringing these sources forward for this deep dive. Really fascinating stuff.